Hi, everyone. Thank you for attending our event today, introducing the 2020-21 Exhibit Columbus Photography Fellows. My name is Ann Surak, and I'm the director of Exhibit Columbus. As a friendly reminder to our audience before we begin, this event is being recorded, and please keep your audio muted. If you'd like to make a comment or ask a question, please use the chat function and stay tuned at the end of the session when we will make time for questions and answers. For those of you joining us for the first time or those new to our work, Exhibit Columbus is a program of the Landmark Columbus Foundation, whose mission is to care for, celebrate, and advance the cultural heritage of Columbus, Indiana. On behalf of the organization and its board of directors, I'm glad to welcome you to our event. The 2020-21 cycle of Exhibit Columbus is exploring the theme New Middles with curators Mimi Zeiger and Iker Gill. In March, we unveiled the design concepts for the 2021 exhibition by our 5 J. Irwin and Xenia S. Miller Prize recipients, 7 University Design Research Fellows, and high school design team. Please visit our website, exhibitcolumbus.org, to view videos of the participants talking about their concepts. In addition to today's event featuring the works of our photography fellows, please join us on Thursday, June 10th at 4 p.m. for another online event with our curators Mimi Zeiger and Iker Gill, in conversation with designer Jeremiah Chu of Some All None, who is creating the graphic identity and wayfinding system for this cycle of Exhibit Columbus. Register for that at exhibitcolumbus.org, and again, catch up on all of our content we've been creating around New Middles through our website. We also invite you to join the conversation on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram using hashtags New Middles and Exhibit Columbus. Follow us at Exhibit Columbus. There are many who support our work and have done so for a long time. As always, thank you to our Design Legacy supporters and all of those that help make Exhibit Columbus a reality. The Design Legacy supporters are key individuals, corporations, and foundations that have supported our work from the beginning and believe passionately in the mission of our organization. We thank them for their vision and unparalleled support. Now I would like to welcome Exhibit Columbus co-curator Iker Gill to join me. He will be introducing today's event. Iker is the director of Mass Studio, a collaborative architecture and design firm. He is also the founder and editor-in-chief of design journal Mass Context, as well as the executive director of the SOM Foundation. Iker was the associate curator for the U.S. Pavilion at the 16th Venice Architecture Biennale. Welcome, Iker.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. After the symposium last fall and the design presentations earlier in the year, Mimi and I are excited to continue to share more aspects of New Middles with the Columbus community and everybody joining us via Zoom. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to reflect on the long history of a city named for Christopher Columbus in a state named for Indians. The land where Columbus, Indiana, is located was ceded to the United States in 1818 through the Treaty of St. Mary's, yet this place has been a site of human activity for more than 12,000 years through the rich and vibrant cultures of the Adena, Hopewell, Cahokia, Shawnee, Miami, Kickapoo, and Delaware nations. We recognize that the languages, cultures, and traditions of these nations continue to this day, and although we're gathering virtually, we remain entwined by land, water, and soil. Today's online event will introduce our New Middles Photography Fellows, Virginia Hanusik and David Schalliol. The theme of this cycle of Exhibit Columbus is New Middles, from Main Street to Megalopolis, what is the future of the Middle City? Building upon Columbus' legacy as a laboratory for design as civic investment, this cycle explores the future of the center of the United States and the regions connected by the Mississippi watershed, an ecology stretching beyond political borders. The fellows, based in Minneapolis and New Orleans, the start and the end of the Mississippi River, explore this network of relationships, multiple centers, and potentials. Today, the fellows will talk about their bodies of work and present images that focus on the Mississippi watershed, including Columbus and the surrounding region. This will be followed by a moderated conversation with special guest Jasmine Benyamin, who will highlight the interconnections between the photography fellows' work and discuss the relationship of photography to design and architecture. As Anne mentioned earlier, for those of you in the audience, if you'd like to ask a question to any of the panelists, please use the chat function at any time during the event. And it is now my pleasure to introduce the moderator of the event and the 2 speakers. Jasmine Benyamin is Associate Professor of Architecture at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee School of Architecture and Urban Planning, where she teaches history and theory courses as well as design studios at the undergraduate and graduate levels. Her interdisciplinary research addresses architectural manifestations in art practice and popular culture, with a particular focus on film and photography. She holds bachelor's degrees in architecture and French literature from Columbia University, a Master of Architecture degree from Yale University, and a PhD from Princeton University. Her dissertation research was the recipient of several grants, including the Canadian Centre for Architecture and fellowships from both the DAAD and Fulbright Foundation. In addition to editing and translating several books on architecture, her essays have appeared in the Journal for the Society of Architectural Historians, Thresholds, Constructs, the Journal of Architectural Education, Off-Ramp, and the Journal of Architecture. David Schalliol is a photographer and sociologist based in Minneapolis, as well as an associate professor of sociology at St. Olaf College, who is interested in the relationship between community and place. His writing and photographs have appeared in such publications as Social Science Research, Mass Context, and the New York Times, as well as in numerous exhibitions, including the 2015 and 2017 Chicago Architecture Biennial, the inaugural Belfast Photo Festival, and at the Museum of Contemporary Photography in Chicago. He's the author of Isolated Building Studies, and his directorial debut, The Area, premiered at the Full Frame Documentary Film Festival in April 2018. Virginia Hanusik is a photographer whose work explores the relationship between landscape, culture, and the built environment. Her projects on climate change, landscape adaptation, and environmental justice have been featured in The New Yorker, Domus, Places Journal, NPR, The Atlantic, Mass Context, and Oxford American, among others, and supported by the Grant Foundation and Mellon Foundation. Her project, A Receding Coast, the Architecture and Infrastructure of South Louisiana, challenges the visual iconography of the climate crisis and has been exhibited internationally. She has lectured at institutions including Columbia University, Bard College, New York University, and Rutgers University about landscape representation and the visual narratives of climate change. She's a member of the Climate Working Group, where she helps coordinate multidisciplinary projects on the climate crisis with artists and scholars. She received her BA from Bard College and lives in New Orleans. Welcome, Ginny.
Thank you so much, Iker, for your introduction, and thank you to everyone at Exhibit Columbus for organizing this event. I was fortunate enough to visit Columbus last month for the first time, and am thoroughly looking forward to returning in August to meet you all and see the full exhibition. I'm going to spend some time going through how I've approached photographing the Mississippi River watershed over the past year, and some of the themes that I'm exploring with this body of work. But just quick background, I've spent, the better part of the last decade photographing South Louisiana. I've lived in New Orleans for most of that time as well. And so when Iker approached me about the potential to expand the work I've been focusing on to a larger geographic zone, I was really excited. A lot of my projects are about the built environment and climate change, how it responds and adapts in a landscape. And this is just a small portfolio from some of the past few years. Water shapes so much of Louisiana, and I was interested in diving into the history of the river, how the human engineering of landscapes thousands of miles away impact what we're currently experiencing here, like coastal erosion. The leveeing of the river has greatly affected the state's land loss crisis because of the lack of sediment flowing into the Gulf, which historically rejuvenates and creates new land. Levees and other interventions in the landscape definitely interrupt that natural process. So I began looking into the major floods that have occurred over the past century or so, and this is by no means a full list, to better understand how our current infrastructure system came to be and the policies that protect certain communities over others. So much of the visual narrative of these floods, like most visually associated with climate change stories as well, are from above in order to give the viewer context for the scale of destruction And as I was looking through these images, again, I became curious about the different ways to approach photographing these systems that have failed. In New Orleans, we experience street flooding regularly. My car flooded last week at 3 o'clock in the morning from a pop-up thunderstorm. I wish I was joking about that, but that's just to say it's very obvious that our water management system is broken and climate change is only going to exacerbate that. Just to give some context of the extent of which we've altered the course of the river, here is one of the famous Fisk maps, which they were made in around 1944 in the early 1940s, which demonstrates the various ways the river's course has changed over time versus the elaborate system of levees that the Army Corps of Engineers has executed starting in the early 20th century. So as this work relates to Columbus and thinking about new middles, I've been focusing on 3 themes that connect these places. The first being infrastructure, obviously, particularly the history of creating this hard infrastructure and the labor practices that have been tied to it. So who does this infrastructure serve, and how sustainable is it really? Agriculture, heavy rain and melting snow washes, and I should have chosen a better picture for this, for the dead zone, but I didn't want to add a bunch of dead fish, so forgive me. But the heavy rain and melting snow washes massive amounts of nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus from lawns, sewage treatment plants, farmland along the Mississippi River and throughout its watershed into the Gulf. And once there, these nutrients trigger algae blooms that ultimately choke off oxygen in the water, making it difficult, if not impossible, for marine life to survive there. In 2017, the dead zone was actually the size of the state of New Jersey. And the third being logistics. So looking at the role of shipping and how the need to maintain a constant river course and depth. In this case, on the left, you'll see the Mississippi River Gulf outlet, shortcuts, navigation canals, how that's influenced environmental degradation. So I've been primarily focusing, been photographing in South Louisiana for the better part of this past year. So that's a majority of the images that you'll be seeing today, but I'll actually be traveling up to Cairo, Illinois this coming week and stopping at sites of significance along the way, including Vicksburg, Memphis, Greenville, the Yazoo pumps in Mississippi, and the New Madrid floodway. So as we go through these images, you'll see kind of the stark difference in what's in color versus black and white, the latter focusing predominantly on heavy infrastructure. So just to orient you, this is the end of the Mississippi River where it meets the Gulf of Mexico and Port Eads. It's an old river control structure, which is about 2 hours northwest of New Orleans. But it was built in 1963 to regulate the flow of the Mississippi River into the Atchafalaya River. So by preventing the Mississippi from changing course. This image is from Venice, Louisiana, which is the most southern point in the state accessible by car. It is an area that is a primary fishing destination, but also there's one road in, one road out at this point, and has a significant amount of wetlands habitat loss, which you see these dead cypress kind of skeletons around, which have died off because of the salinity of the water has changed as the coastal landscape of the state has depleted. You have more salt water coming in and changing that that habitat there. You can go to the next one. So this was taken in Plaquemines Parish also, which is just Grand Bayou Village is a little bit north of Venice. The seafood industry is a primary economic driver in this parish, which was heavily impacted by hurricanes, especially this past year. And as I just mentioned, with the increase of storms, the decrease in wetlands, which are the natural hurricane protection system, you have these areas that normally haven't been as exposed to flooding and storm surge becoming increasingly more at risk. So this is in a coastal landscape, but it's also in New Orleans, with the infrastructure that has been created post-Katrina, kind of making the city, turning it into a fortress as the coast around it is eroding pretty rapidly. The next one. Looking at just the stark contrast in terms of how this really heavy infrastructure is juxtaposed to the natural landscape here. So water, as I previously mentioned, is something that is everywhere. And in terms of how it has shaped cultural and physical geography, is definitely a primary factor. Route 1 is not the only raised road in the state, but it is the only access point to Port Fourchon, which is a major oil and gas hub for offshore rigs. It also, Route 1 is the only road that provides access to Grand Isle, which is Louisiana's last inhabited barrier island. So focusing on the impacts of these other processes that are happening farther up in the watershed. So as I mentioned, agriculture runoff and pollution, and also the leveeing and damming of the river itself, how that has impacted the landscape here, because no longer, sediment is no longer being transported through the Mississippi River. It doesn't have that change that it has naturally had over time to kind of provide that continuous land making cycle. So we're imposing for that and creating these massive structures to kind of make up for that natural process that's been lost. You can go to the next one. In Delacroix, this is in St. Bernard Parish, which is about 60 miles east of New Orleans, outside of the flood protection system. St. Bernard was intentionally flooded in the 1927 flood to essentially lessen the pressure on the levee system in New Orleans, which has been argued and that it wasn't necessary. But thinking about how that violence and act of sacrificing certain areas over to preserve others, and how that is a continuous event that we're seeing as late as 2011, which there was a major flood that town in Missouri called Pinhook was completely destroyed in order to preserve certain farmland in Illinois. So these are events that are still happening. So with this project, I'm thinking about those consequences as well. You can go to the next one. Also, in terms of architecture and the ways that we've been adapting to these changing landscapes, raised camps, raised houses, that's really a signature of South Louisiana at this point. This is in just a bit south of Route 1. So at this point, there's only one road in and one road out. So all of these structures are only accessible by boat. Go to the next. The Bonnet Carré Spillway, which is about 12 miles west of New Orleans, was built in 1931. So after the 1927 flood, to once the river reaches a certain flood stage, will divert water from the river to Lake Pontchartrain lessening the pressure on the New Orleans levee system. So it's been opened 15 times since it was originally built. And it's a spectacle that whenever it's open, people usually go to see the Army Corps lift those gates. So, in terms of thinking about, again, how this infrastructure has become normalized or even celebrated, and how much does that impact the way that we go about thinking that this is the way things should be, or that we sometimes oversee the detrimental effects of that. You can go to the next. So this is kind of shifting aesthetically into more of the structural images, if you want to call them that. But this is at South Pass, which is south of Venice in the Bird's Foot Delta. Obviously, where all of the shipping cargo boats come through to the Port of New Orleans, but farther north. So kind of capturing that logistics activity happening there. You can go to the next. This is from my recent trip to Columbus, photographing some of the farmland out there. This is just east of the city in Decatur County, but really trying to explore the shapes and forms of these types of infrastructure in black and white, trying to really get at the structural component. And I found out on this trip that Indiana is the 8th largest agricultural exporter in the country. So lots of beautiful farmland, and really trying to be able to capture how that connects to the experiences that we're having here in Louisiana. And you can kind of just go through the next couple of ones because they're, these are all from, except from, some of those were from the old river control structure. These are levees that will go up to, I think I went all the way up to Natchez. If you go to the next one, kind of looking at, it's a little small on the screen, but looking at kind of the signage that are on a lot of the Mississippi River bridges to kind of gauge how high the water is, how much clearance you have to go underneath the bridge, kind of these navigation signs. You can go to the next. The Bonnet Carré Spillway again. You can go to the next one. And I think my last one is of the, oh wait, no, there's one more. And in terms of signage and thinking about the ways that we're talking about this infrastructure and how it's communicated. So the navigation, signage and symbols, but also in terms of memorials and kind of what plaques and kind of memorabilia we have around sites of violence and this flooding. So obviously this is in the lower 9th Ward, the industrial canal levee that broke during Hurricane Katrina, and just kind of being able to capture the setting and context of these places that hold so much historical significance and are symbols of deep environmental and climate injustice. And then the final one that I have is of the Lake Pontchartrain Causeway, which is the longest continuous bridge over a body of water in the world.
So here we go. Everyone see my screen okay? So I just want to say, good afternoon. I'm really excited to talk to you about my New Middles project. And I'm literally in Columbus right now. And so I spent the last several days getting to know people in person and making work. And it's especially gratifying to be here now because I've been thinking about it so much over the last year of my project. And as the work on the project really is coming to a close, being here feels like a story that's really ending at the beginning. And so, for the last several days, of course, I've spent time photographing and exploring all this sort of like modern art, Art Deco landmarks. But this project isn't just about these parts of Columbus. That, of course, this project is about all sorts of other things. And so I've been visiting drag races in nearby towns, where on the right you can see an 80-year-old racer who's been racing for more than 30 years, to checking out wetlands and vintage baseball games, and also talking with families who are planting in community gardens. And so more generally, this fellowship has provided me the opportunity to link new work with more than 20 years of photographic and sociological projects that I've made throughout the Mississippi watershed. And so one of the many remarkable attributes of the watershed, and we saw that amazing map that Jenny was sharing a little bit ago, is that it's just unimaginably vast and varied. And so as we think about the watershed in relationship to new middles, we're talking about everything from agricultural centers turned innovation hubs to desert ghost towns to really industrial powerhouses. And so the issues that created and still affect these places are so heterogeneous that really trying to address them all seems maybe impossible, except to say something uselessly broad, like, they all need water, or they're all in North America. But as a photographer and as a sociologist, I do want to work towards a larger conceptual framework. And so over the years, I've made all manner of specific projects in the region, from differential development patterns in Greater Knoxville, Tennessee, to not-for-profit-led mural installation projects in St. Louis, to the closure and consolidation of Catholic churches in a former coal mining community in Pennsylvania. And much of that work has been focused on the built environment, where in Chicago, itself an interesting place for discussing the watershed, because it drains into the Great Lakes, but because the reverse Chicago River also connects it to the Mississippi, that I've made projects like the Isolated Building Studies, which looks at the common effect of divergent investment practices in the city. And so all of these projects are also stories of the watershed, and they're part of the minutiae that link the places within it. And so faith and depopulation, the strength of communities, structural inequalities, and more. But I wanted to think about the watershed as its like interconnectedness, how it's embedded in systems that are unfathomably larger than it. And so to me, a big part of this new work has been looking at the systems that connect these places and how these systems create the theme for this year's theme for the biennial, New Middles. And so making this project is also personal for me. I was born about an hour from Columbus and have lived in the watershed for all but a few years of my life, Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, now Minnesota. And over the years, I've visited nearly every state in the watershed. So the ones that are close by, like Kentucky, Missouri, Pennsylvania, but the other ones that really aren't usually put in the same sentence with those states, or for that matter, really each other, like Georgia, Montana, and New Mexico. And so some of my experience seems, I think, really intertwined with the stories of the watershed, and I think at least in the popular imagination of the Midwest. And so it could be like, canoeing through Minnesota's 10,000 lakes, or watching a movie on the side of a barn. But I know that other seemingly unrelated activities like eating breakfast or even teaching a class are just as much a part of the watershed as those stories as well. And so foregrounding Columbus in my thinking about New Middles makes these personal experiences is even more potent, because after all, now that I'm here in Columbus, I'm not just thinking about these big systems. I'm thinking about visiting with friends who were excited to start college here, or passing through on the way to visit my grandparents when I was a kid. And all of this is just a reminder that there's so much detail, so much weight, so much life everywhere. And so for me, then, how do all these elements intersect? So, inspired by these environmental systems that really unite the whole watershed, my project for New Middles focuses on two themes as I see them revealed in the landscape. First off, systems of interconnection and systems of representation. As you'll see, that this work is expansive, and part of that breadth is really made possible by the special way that we'll be able to display Jenny's and my work in Columbus, but I suppose more about that another time. So first, I want to talk about interconnection, and I'm going to start from water. And so starting from the interconnections created by water, I think of water as this direct visual theme in the work, and it plays a dual role. So on one hand, it's there to remind us of how water and the watershed is an anchor for this project, but it's also there because water itself is one of the systems that produce experiences, some discordant, others uniting across the region. And so, I've represented water throughout this project in many forms. So part of this is going to be play, domestic labor, environmental relationships, and also the history and present of the challenges that emerge because of longstanding approaches to living and building near water. Of course, we've heard a little bit of that from Jenny already, but of course, my hope was that you get a chance to hear more about her work before we talk about this particular piece. But to highlight one of the particular images, we can pause for a moment on this image of Minneapolis, where the degree of the human control of the Mississippi River is so clear. And so here in the heart of downtown Minneapolis last summer, the flow of the Mississippi River was dramatically restricted. And the idea was to allow engineers to inspect the underside of the Stone Arch Bridge. And those few days produced quite the spectacle and a reminder of how humans organize the river, or at least they attempt to. And in comparison, I also like to think about the way that frozen lakes and frozen water are really transformed into small cities as the ice fisher people, head out and create new neighborhoods on the ice in winter. And so extending from this environmental system are the production, consumption, and distribution systems that generate local and global connections. And so here we can see a first representation of an image that's beyond that at the intersection of agricultural and industrial systems. And so whether in industrial agriculture, that operations that are really embedded in small cities, or pumpkin patches that are along state highways, we see this sort of interplay. If you're wondering about the color on the image on the right, this was taken towards an early fall when the fires from Seattle, from the broader Washington and northwestern United States region were coming as far as Minneapolis. And so that's the hazy sky there. And so taking commercial agriculture as an example, the project puts small-scale community-supported agriculture in southern Minnesota in dialogue with cattle feedlots in the Texas Panhandle. And so we can see this, and sort of really in juxtaposition, we see how their shared reliance on the watershed manifest really dramatically different forms, pointing to the different dynamics that define their respective markets. Or we can see these other kinds of tensions that might be manifesting in the conflicting uses of place in places like Oklahoma City, where hydraulic fracturing may be conducted side by side with homes and residential neighborhoods. And how they then manifest in different ways through labor conflicts. And so in this case, even when it's negative 11 degrees Fahrenheit, or that's about negative 24 Celsius outside, there's a lockout in a marathon facility in South St. Paul. And so, with that, I want to focus then on this second part of the project, which is to think about representation. And so amongst all of that interconnection, I'm interested in local experiences and personal experiences. And as a sociologist who studies the relationship between people and place, one of the most exciting elements for me to look at is how people publicly present their connections to the environment. And so much of this is done in architecture, whether that be in vernacular or the kinds of buildings that Columbus is so famous for. But architecture is only really part of the built environment. And so, a lot of this other part of the project is really focusing on representations of place and how they offer hints of someone or who a group is, from the need to memorialize Buddy Holly and the other musicians who were killed on the day the music died in Iowa, or the hacienda used as a mailbox. Really, each of them special creations by individuals. Or we can think about expressions of faith along the roadside, whether in rural Texas or in not so far from here in Brown County. Or a kind of classic roadside attraction. We can think about the largest ball of twine made by one person in Darwin, Minnesota, or the Texan cowboys of the myth of the West along the pre-interstate highway routes. I suppose finally here, these examples in the Columbus area, we can see it in the Brown County families, Wood and Morels, to Cummins Engine, which is so proudly illuminated at night. And so I think about these self-expressions as saying so much about how people think of and they present themselves. And their publicness is a really remarkable way that people connect with others, even if only through a brief moment of joy or curiosity or sorrow. And so in this way, I'm especially interested in sites like the site of this Mexican-American market in rural Oklahoma, where paint peeling aside, there's such a clear merging of national and cultural symbols, and a sense that, they're how the systems of interconnection and distinction are interpreted by individuals, really for the public. Or in the equally political, but maybe sculptural forms of bald eagles carved out of a tree trunk in the snow, or these three giant former president busts in rural South Dakota sitting outside an RV park. Or in the collaborative memorial and gathering place of George Floyd Square in Minneapolis, where groups of activists and community members have collectively created a unique site for voicing and organizing for racial justice, again, linking self-representation to the potent national issues in place. And so as I wrap up, I'm interested in combining this idea of interconnection and representation. And I hope that it expresses a kind of dynamic present that's intertwined with power, struggles to maintain what is and was, and new possible futures. And so for this work on sort of new middles, Columbus and its location in the watershed is really the kernel that grows into a way of thinking about the network of social, economic, and environmental systems that connect me, all the way up in Minnesota, and many of you to wherever you are. And so addressing those systems, I think, is also essential for understanding what is, but also figuring out, how we're going to address the broad consequences of climate change, environmental justice, and more. And so, my hope is that by emphasizing these systems of interconnection and representation, this project can orient us towards thinking about new representations and new interconnections that are based on shared principles of addressing these issues from our own communities. And so not the least of which is addressing the environmental consequences of action from community art projects that provide ways to engage our neighborhoods, or restoring the systems we've halted, like the role of fire in the landscape. And we can think about how these small scale actions of environmentalism can be wrapped up with community building activities. Here, just taking these small towns scattered throughout Minnesota, where everything from fireworks to scout groups to just community projects are funded through environmental or through recycling campaigns. To thinking about examples from Columbus, where how pollinator parks provide footholds for native species, and how urban agriculture provides ways to connect with some of the systems that are often hidden by urban life, while providing a way to increase access to, to quality local food. And so, my hope is that we can do all of this while keeping in mind the urgency to change the way that we've constructed our lives within the environment and within the watershed, and really to make important choices about our future and our future within it. Thank you.
Without further ado, Jasmine, you can take it from here.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, everyone. And special thanks to Mimi and Iker for the invitation, and David and Ginny for the inspirational images. So let me share. I think I have, what, five minutes. We're running a little late, so I'll go super fast. Okay, so what happens when you're asked to do the sort of a, does everybody see my screen? Okay, great. Oh, Jasmine, please, can you do a quick and dirty kind of run through of the entire history of photography and architecture, and I don't know, maybe add a few other things and make connections. So it's a privilege to do this, and it was nice to kind of go back to my dissertation and look at that old document again for some references. But first of all, I think I wanted to sort of just put my bias out there, which is that I tend to not like the word architectural photography, and I actually prefer the photography of architecture. And the reason for that is I think architectural photography kind of presumes a kind of preconceived disciplinary kind of autonomy within the larger field of photography. And I'm interested in the photography of architecture and the built environment. that includes this work, but also is more heterogeneous in its interests. And I think aesthetic questions, of course, remain, but so too are there concerns about the way that images function and operate within a larger kind of media matrix. So the images that I'll show are maybe some familiar, some not so familiar individual artifacts, but I think they also sort of circulate in relation to a larger project. So of course, in the beginning, there's always a sort of origin story. Pre-negatives, architecture was, as you can imagine, a favorite topic of photography because it didn't move. And thank God for that, because exposure times had to be quite long. So here we have Degas, Boulevard du Temple, and Talbot's view of Paris boulevards from 1843. As cameras and lens technologies developed at the turn of the century, photographic topics, authors, and audiences expanded. With this expansion came a renewed interest in defining the role of the medium. So is it art, is it document? Should we care about making the distinction? Why is that important? So here we have Matesius's collotype plates at the end of one of his manifestos on English architecture. Here's another one of examples from this time the English house. It's interesting here is as printing practices then became industrialized, photographs of architecture started to intermingle with text and other drawings. And pretty quickly, this is, I think, where things get interesting. Because now photographs are emerging in the conversations about the built environment, not only in galleries or in personal albums, but also in illustrated journals and photographs. So here's an example of sort of set up by Paul Schutz and Naumburg of sort of good examples and bad examples, the good being on the top of city planning. Here's Charles Latham, English photographer, aesthetic photographer from his Gardens of Italy of 1905. And then I think we also have photography, of course, as a vehicle for social change. So Jacob Riis is the first person that comes to mind for me, Family in Bronx Settlement from 1910. But also in public lectures and promotional material, Walter Gropius's unpublished notes, lecture notes for his 1911 lecture. And here he sort of cut and pasted little photographs in his notes for the lecture. And here we have examples of promotional materials for his Fagus Factory of 1911. And again, Gropius again, this time with crop marks. So not only promotional material, but sort of internal archives and the control tactics that architects sort of start to engage in. And these are his crop marks, if you can see there, to really start to edit the story and to crop out history. Another guy who was really good at cropping out history was Corbusier. So we see some grain silos, grain elevators in the top that were photographs from the US that circulated in Europe. But the first time they circulated in Europe was in 1912 in a German yearbook. But then, of course, Corbusier decided the top of it needed to get lopped off because it just wasn't modern enough. So that's 1923. And then, of course, we have people who use photography as kind of polemical agents, sort of critiquing rapid urban change. So we have, on the one hand, Corbusier's selective cropping, but then we have Adjet's sort of historical archive of a Paris soon to be erased. And I think that sort of the connection between photography of the built environment and historic preservation becomes really quite important as well. And of course, we have celebrations of abstraction, manifestos of new schools of architectural thinking, and Molinage here is given as an example, or how about as part of conceptual art practices in Ed Ruscha's Every Building on the Sunset Strip, or how about Eggleston's conceptual sort of explorations using sort of realism in photography of rural America. And this is from a series in Mississippi in 1976, or critiques indeed of surveillance. And here we have Thomas Wolfe, his Night series.
Like David Have you explored the Columbus Riverside, and do you have thoughts about its equitable access and its role in the city center development?
Sure. I mean, so I should preface this, response by saying I don't have a lot of experience with the riverfront, but I have had some really remarkable opportunities over the last several days to really spend some time along the riverfront. In particular, getting a chance to talk to planners and designers who are working on some real improvements. One of the things that I think is really exciting about the riverfront as it is, though, is the use of Millrace Park as this really public space. It's hard after spending so much time in Chicago not to think about this question in the context of Chicago, with this notion of the forever free and clear, this idea that the lakefront should always be open to the public. As we think about the important spaces like Millrace Park and the way that it's been programmed, both architecturally and naturally, or the intertwining between those two things, I think is a really lovely example of the way that a riverfront can be transformed into a place that is for all. And I will say that again, that I'm not deeply embedded in the local issues. I'm not familiar with particular conflicts that may be playing out on the waterfront. But from my outside perspective and the conversations with planners and others, I've been impressed by what I've learned about the park over the last several days.
I left with three framing sort of questions. The first one is thinking about scoping wide. So instead of scaling up or down horizontally, but more horizontally and broadly, and scoping wide is one sort of thing I thought we could sort of talk about in both your work. And the other is recentering the center. Using, for example, our map apps that tell us if we'd like to recenter when we start wandering off the map. How does your work bring the middle back into the image? And then the last one is sort of this thinking of ideas of images as writerly. In other words, photographs that invite the reader to actively engage with the images and perhaps even contribute to their meanings. So there we go. Feel free to take up any one of those.
I think, I'll start just talking about the reorientation or bringing the work back to the middle, because I am so far south. The Gulf Coast has, especially I think in the past several years, as hurricane season has just become worse and worse, almost been treated as an anomaly in terms of the disasters that happen here. I mean, not to disqualify any other disaster zones, like, of course, the wildfires and drought and other horrible things that are happening from climate change. But I think that there's a lot of talk about climate migration happening here as land has been lost in South Louisiana, and you have some of the first adaptation policies and strategies to actually relocate and move people away from the water. So what does that mean in terms of moving farther inland? And is the middle of the country, I don't want to say safe, but I think that there's some sort of illusion that we have that the farther away from the coast you go, the better protected you are, the less risk you have, when in fact flooding from major, as we've seen in the past decade, especially flooding that's been happening in the Mississippi, the watershed itself is becoming more severe, more regular. And the systems that we have in place to kind of control that water is no longer serving in the way that it was designed to. So, when I'm thinking about kind of the connection between here and the middle, it's thinking about risk of exposure to the impacts of climate change, and how those how it's kind of been talked about in the media, especially in terms of climate migration and the connection between the coasts and the middle of the country.
Yeah, and I think the oscillating in scales, I mean, the huge scale of question, and then how to manage that in one image. And I think that in both your works, I sense a continuum, and that you're capturing sort of one moment that's been extracted.
I mean, I think about the work and in relationship to both scale and scope, and also thinking about this notion of centrality or the middleness of it, is trying to think about like where, like conceptually, what does the middle mean? And as we think about, it's like one of the reasons I've been trying to, as I've been making this work that's across this, literally, almost across the country. I suppose north to south across the country, but in vast area in the United States, thinking about this idea of, I've been emphasizing this notion of interconnection and thinking about those networks as a way of sort of saying, like the middle in some ways can be almost anywhere, depending on how the network is constructed and reframed. And as we think about our discourse and the way that we can foreground something or center something in the discourse, my hope is that this project, these projects, this event or series of events can really play a role in saying, what can the center be? What can the network be? What can action be? And when we start to think about ourselves in relationship to each other, like what additional power manifests from that new conceptualization?
And of course, some of these things are happening elsewhere and not just in the center, but what is it about what's happening in the center that maybe puts a sort of new lens on things? Is it that things are exacerbated in terms of climate, or that things sort of come to a head literally along the Mississippi?
I mean, I certainly see those elements of the Mississippi as playing that role, and people can see, particularly as we think about the watershed and we think about flooding. And here, I'm, being in Columbus right now, I'm thinking about the 2008 flood, but of course we can think of, name a year and name a geography, right? And we can find a place where flooding has affected that area. And so again, this idea of thinking of, it's like multiple centers, the multiplicity of the interconnection. I'm thinking that, that like, as Jenny was saying about this idea that moving inland doesn't necessarily mean moving away from threat, right? Because the threat is something that is ever present, that is ever expanding, and it requires action that is equally expansive.
I also will say, and this is a little bit more abstract, but I think our approach to water management specifically and trying to reduce risk and reduce flooding has actually exacerbated the problem. And thinking about things or an approach to a climate strategy or a way to live, in a symbiotic way with the natural world is going to be different in different locations. So I think that our approach in a coastal environment is going to be different from in a plains environment, et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of thinking about the center maybe in a way of being like a blueprint or kind of orienting oneself in a landscape, when in fact it's really about how are all of these pieces connected, but what are the differences that are critical to understanding in order for these places to survive and thrive in an equitable way.
Yeah, I think David's point about architecture just being a small part of what we're talking about in terms of the built environment, I think really feeds into this, right? The sort of the scoping wide, that architects tend to sort of narrow their focus, and we have to sort of get reminded to widen our scope. Before we have some questions, I think one of my sort of wonders is, if you agree with my assessment of your work as writerly. In other words, do you invite others to do you welcome those alternative readings? Do you allow sort of spectators of your work to sort of create their own narratives about what's going on? Is that something you welcome?
I do. A lot of inspiration for this work and thinking about kind of the historic imagery, these archival images of this infrastructure, and how that's really the only time that these landscapes get photographed unless there's a major flood. So I don't think that historically it's been they have been spaces that are meant to be interpreted in a creative, abstract way, or to be open to dialogue with people. And I definitely would like for that to happen, and for there to be more visual engagement and documentation and how these systems interact with the landscape, with communities around them, to, you know, kind of question what future role they play.
And I really think about one of I agree with this idea of the approach or the accessibility of photography and the sort of capacity of, people to sort of write their own interpretation of what they're seeing. And it's one of the reasons that I'm so interested in visual methodologies in my own work, because I think it helps democratize the process of looking, and by hopefully highlighting these different kinds of processes. I'm obviously bringing my own point of view, and I make it very clear that I have a point of view in the work that I'm making. But at the same time, there's this idea that I'd like to be able to provide, agency to the viewer. One of the reasons that I provide, 2 photographs on so many of those slides is I have something that I'm thinking about in the interplay between those 2 images. But I recognize that by showing 2 images simultaneously means that people are going to be picking up on their own connections in a way, and hopefully highlighting, based on their own experience, how they're coming to the image. And so the hope is that there's that sort of like amplification of the capacity of that like more democratic viewing. And one of the reasons I'm so excited about seeing our work out in the city is going to be, again, without saying too much about that, but I mean, it's just to see the way that different contexts, different kinds of environments can provide those different opportunities for reading, writing, one's own perspective.
Yeah, and I think credit to Iker and Mimi for bringing this idea of photography into the conversation and the discipline itself, literally in the conversation, by having you as fellows this year. And I think that's one way of sort of generating some new conversations about these topics that maybe wouldn't otherwise happen if the images were shown in another setting. And so the fact that they're sort of brought to this city in this time, I think really highlights some of the imperatives, that ethical and otherwise, that we, draw focus on, that we really need to look at. I think I wanted to go to some of the questions. Mimi asks, what is involved in the process of your work? So you've got, I imagine there's a lot of driving, meeting people, finding sites of interest. What could you sort of shed a little light, David and Ginny, on that process?
Yeah, I mean, like I mentioned, I feel as if the second half of my work is going to be done in the next several weeks as I go up to Cairo and get a little farther north. And that process, a lot of it has been research and reading about, various flood events and kind of the history of infrastructure on the river, and then mapping out specific sites of significance that I'll be photographing. So that is a bit different than my process locally, which because of my work here for the past several years, I have a network of people that are involved in coastal restoration efforts here that have helped me get access to some of the sites, like in Port Eads and the lighthouse there. So I'm more knowledgeable of what's happening here in terms of coastal restoration and climate policy, and what's happening on the river. But for the places that I've been fortunate enough and will be visiting, that's more of a research type approach to it. So.
Yeah, and I'll say for me, the work is a mix of that kind of just like exploration, element of just being out in the world and sort of seeing what's there, combined with really sort of like, I guess, 2 different kinds of research. One piece being sort of deep conversations and meaningful conversations with people about what's important to them in a place, and sort of letting that perspective guide a little bit where I'm looking, as a way of hopefully amplifying that, that vision, not just simply sort of like my reading of the landscape. And then also this sort of like additional research work that goes into it. I think, Obviously, Jenny, you really see the research piece of it in relationship to the structural kind of stuff that you're doing. And my work is probably not quite so rigorous in that way, but really trying to think about what are new ways to understand a place. And one piece of that is reading about history, looking at demographics, and then of course, building on those conversations from other people.
Yeah, Peter Wang mentions that he sees references to Alec Soth's Along the Mississippi River, but also Joel Sternfeld's photographs of the cross-country road trip. And I don't know if you got to see, the last image I showed was Katie Newell's work in Michigan on sort of barn infrastructures. And I think it brings us to the last part of his sort of comment, which is, do you think about how how you guys are pushing the envelope vis-a-vis the sort of the history of photography, or what do you think you're sort of contributing to the conversation that, there are others that are sort of working in these kind of allied fields as well?
Well, I can jump in. I think, rather than necessarily situating my work within the sort of photographic discourse, although I certainly do, and I'm aware of that discourse, and those references make perfect sense to me in relationship to the work that I've presented here. I think one of the hopes that in the work is not only about the image, but it's about the way that the image connects with people, or the way that image is displayed. And so, one of the things that I'm really excited about with this opportunity to be a fellow with Exhibit Columbus is to be part of a really different kind of discourse. And so part of that is an architecture or sort of built environment related discourse, of which I'm engaged, but not necessarily in this site, in this kind of way, in this specific community. And by this community, I mean those of us who are here right now. But then I also think about the way that the work will be displayed and shared and connected in Columbus, and thinking about how important it is that work is public, and how important it is that there's a strong program that's built around it, that's not just about interpretation, but opportunities for excitement and engagement and people making things their own. And so I think that this project is really an important one to me, where it's not just about making the images, but it's about how does all the material that's associated with all the activities that are associated with it. And I think of that as being one of the major pieces that may not be aesthetic, but I think is still in part of the aesthetics, and of course part of the politics and social engagement.
Yeah, I think today, especially the fact that we would ever be able to see one image or have the luxury of just seeing a singular image in a vacuum is, in a way, sort of non-existent. Yeah, Jenny, sorry.
Yeah, no, I agree with David in terms of the forum for the work. And I think it's so special to be able, as a photographer, to have your work in conversation with other really talented, creative people that are working and exploring these complex issues of place. And I was going to say, that a lot of my work is influenced by previous projects about the Mississippi River, like Alex Soth and Richard Misrock, who did a pretty profound series on Cancer Alley, which is a stretch of the river between Baton Rouge and New Orleans. So his work, the work that Kate Orff did with him on that book, Petrochemical America. So thinking kind of in terms of how to communicate these systems that we often oversee or are hidden in some ways, especially with the infrastructure. I mean, in New Orleans, we're surrounded by levees and flood walls and canals, and there's only a certain accessing the riverfront you're only able to do it in like 2 parks that are opposite ends of the city. Otherwise, it's like the port of New Orleans. So, it's like seeing water and seeing how this infrastructure kind of cuts off a lot of that access to it. But I also thinking about kind of in conversation with the work and kind of these historical images, I'm also kind of thinking a lot about the propaganda used to move people into like these floodplains and how photography was a part of that, and using, you know, the images of like an ideal home or like all of these subdivisions as a means of kind of maybe skewing the truth that maybe people didn't know at the time, but there are definitely people that knew, like developers knew that. So I think that photography certainly has a role in terms of thinking about the history of like how we've developed and normalized living in these really flood prone areas.
Yeah, and I think that the word watershed is really important because this comes up in Jennifer's comment about taming the river, that it's a very particular connection, water-land connection.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, and that creates very unique conversations potentially about how people live and on what side of the edge they live.
I think one thing that maybe just to jump in, one aspect that is interesting about the work of Ginny and David is also that how they use photography to tell important issues, but also that they've done that through a long research. Like David has been working, you know, for 20 years on this aspect, and then it's just this is an opportunity to look at, explore those topics and put them in conversation with Columbus and its region. So it's a way to advance the work, but it's not something that someone just drops, takes a camera, takes 3 photographs, and then just kind of like tries to contextualize. And you know, David, I think you said like even if it's not like as research heavy, but it's like in a way what is interesting from you is like you're coming from a PhD in sociology. So it's a completely different understanding on the built environment and how you use photography to tell some of those aspects that you've explored in sociology, but translate that in photography. And the same thing with you, Ginny, which not only like South Louisiana, but you've also been exploring like the East Coast, and you moved there and you live there for a while. So it's like, what is interesting for Mimi and I think is just understanding how these long-term projects now have an opportunity to advance, to be in dialogue, to have to establish this conversation between different places of the country that are interconnected, through in this case to the Mississippi watershed, and how do we advance the conversation and raise issues that are important. So I think it's just a fantastic opportunity to bring that and to kind of like have that conversation through their work.
And I guess I was wondering, and thank you so much, Jasmine, Ginny, and David, for these incredible presentations today. It's quite moving for me to see the work start to coalesce and also start to see images of Columbus start to populate a body of work that we have become familiar with in our conversations, and now start to see it represented. But I was curious, from now that both of you have visited Columbus, what some of your takeaways have been as you've sort of toured the architecture, started to meet with people, and you know how that might be reframing the middle as well.
I can jump in. So, you know, one of the things that's really clear to me in the conversations or the experiences I've been having over the last several days have really been the way that people want to have these sort of like deep, enriching kind of conversations about the city, but not just the city on its own. It's not just like, what do you think of the city, right? But it's how to think about the city in relationship to these bigger picture issues. And so, you know, I think maybe the traditional way that we might think about this in Columbus would be to think about, the Sarnan churches, or to think about, the legacy of the Millers or something like this. But to really see that the narrative is not just that. It's not just how does architecture in sort of this very narrow way, how does that connect to the city? But instead, it's about how do all these other issues, arise, and how can we speak to them through Columbus? And so I was just thinking this morning, going out with someone to a site where an area that had been flooded in 2008, and there's a proposal to potentially do some additional work there, and just like thinking about how that conversation was not just about what's happening here, but how what's happening here is connected to what's happening so many other places. And so that's been really exciting to me, to see that the outstanding things that, for which Columbus is famous, right, that those things become those things are referenced, but they're not referenced in a self-congratulatory way, but instead of starting a conversation about something bigger.
Yeah, and I was only able to spend a weekend there, and I'm looking forward to going back. But in the short time that I was there, talking with people and saying where I was coming from, and obviously there's talking about the project and how interested people are in really bridging those dots and knowing that there's a connection in that we have a shared ecology, and being able to see that landscape. It was my first time in Indiana, so really being able to have a better grasp on the topography and how beautiful it is in the spring, and all of the farmland was something that was really special. And just Columbus itself, I think, is so unique and a really special thing to be a part of. So I'm looking forward to the exhibit.
Yeah, and I really look forward to seeing the writerly reactions of the local community in Columbus and how they engage with the work. I think it's going to be super fascinating to see.
Yeah, I think we're really excited we'll be able to show these photographs in public space, like David sort of hinted at, so that we don't have to necessarily go into a gallery setting in order to enjoy them.
Right,
so
exactly.
They kind of reemerge back into the built environment, which I think is going to be kind of great to be able to read these images of far away against the very local. So we're bridging that sort of the wide, sort of going wide and recentering simultaneously. But I see that Anne has joined us to probably wrap it up here. Okay.
I don't want to interrupt, but I think that it's time to stop. Thank you, Jasmine, Jenny, and David, for being a part of today's event. It was really wonderful to see the work that you have and really get excited for what's going to be around Columbus very soon. Thank you also to our Landmark Columbus Board of Directors and our Design Legacy supporters. Much gratitude to all of you for being an integral part of making Exhibit Columbus a reality. Of course, a huge thank you to our Exhibit Columbus team, Mimi Zeiger, Iker Gill, Janice Shimizu, Ben Valentine, Hadley Fruits, Jamie Goldsboro, Elizabeth Kubani, and Richard McCoy. The graphics for our program today were created by our new middles graphic designer, Jeremiah Chu of Samal Nun. Jeremiah will be in conversation with Mimi Zeiger and Iker Gill on Thursday, June 10th at 4 p.m. So please register for that event. We are excited to have you with us today. Thank you so much. Stay connected to our work by following us on social media, signing up for our newsletter, and we look forward to seeing everyone in Columbus on August 21st for the opening of Exhibit Columbus 2021. Thank you so much and have a great week.